Welcome back to WTFGAS, the place where we dare to ask questions that most people don't really care about. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the characters from Star Trek Deep Space Nine and tier ranking them based on their individual performances and their contributions to the deep lore of this show. This is not a completely comprehensive list, but I do think this does pretty much encompass every recurring character. And as you'll see, this is a massive cast for a show in terms of people who appear in multiple episodes and who have a broader significance for the development of this show and also the events of the Star Trek universe at this time. Deep Space Nine is easily my favorite Star Trek series, and it's almost probably my favorite show as well. I can't really think of another show that I like better than Deep Space Nine. It's very rare that I watch a show more than once, but I've already watched Deep Space Nine twice. And that's in the context of me not discovering Star Trek until 2016. So most people who were into Trek got into it as kids. I was 30 when I first watched Star Trek, so there you go. Anyway, let's get into this list of characters by considering the most important character of them all, and that would be Captain Ben Sisko. And I don't think the fan is picking up too bad, but my fan was running pretty hard there, so I was just checking the audio real fast. Alright, so Ben Sisko is the commander first of Deep Space Nine. He later gets promoted to captain. And in addition to the space station, he also commands the U.S.S. Defiant, which is a small ship that is built exclusively for combat. Sisko is a very conflicted leader. So unlike Picard, he's not quite as by the book. Now, Picard, of course, once things go south, he will get more creative. But Sisko is much more willing to be open about his defiance of order. He also has to have that kind of flexibility for the job that he holds, since Deep Space Nine is this multi-ethnic frontier state. And it's also a place that's been riven by war. So I have to imagine that some of the writers, especially as the series progressed, when they were looking for the kinds of conflicts Sisko would have to manage, they were thinking about some of the ongoing U.S. efforts to bring peace in places like Bosnia. Now, of course, the show starts a little bit before NATO got involved in the Bosnian and Serbian conflict after the breakup of Yugoslavia, but still I can see some parallels in terms of the kinds of hurt that was there. I mean, this was a society in Bajor that was rebuilding, and Sisko, as the representative of the Federation, had to really do a lot to make that happen. And he's not a naturally patient or diplomatic man, so this was very much a burden on him, and yet he approached it gamely. He's also a family man, which is very unusual for Star Trek captains. Most of them are ardent careerists who never made time for a wife or family. He's going through grief after having lost his wife at the Battle of Wolf 359, so that adds another layer of complexity to Sisko. He also is someone who becomes a religious figure because of an accident when he discovers the wormhole aliens that the Bajorans worship as gods. And if that weren't enough, he's now in the front lines of the Dominion War, and he quickly becomes one of the great heroes of the Federation in that conflict. Sisko also does not have a lot of direct supervision, so he's very free to explore some more amoral choices, and so some of the best episodes are him doing just that. I don't know for sure if Sisko is the best captain in Star Trek, but I think he's definitely the most interesting. And the problems that he faces are far and away the hardest to deal with. That being said, it's also interesting that he's sometimes a little bit hands-off, and there are episodes where there are major crises where the other officers on the station have to do most of the work. So it's an interesting dynamic, and overall I love Ben Sisko. He's one of my favorite characters in anything, and he is an easy S tier for me. Next up is his father, Joseph Sisko, who only appears in a few episodes. Joseph Sisko, unlike his son, is not a Starfleet type. So a lot of the Starfleet guys come from families that have been in Starfleet for generations, which is also somewhat typical of a military organization. A lot of officers are second or third or fourth generation. But Joseph Sisko is a guy who just wants to run a Cajun restaurant in New Orleans, and he's content with that. He has a lot of suspicion about travel in space. He was a reluctant visitor to Deep Space Nine, and I think that it's safe to say that he would probably be happy if his son had decided to retire early and bail out of Starfleet. Joseph Sisko also takes a principled stand in one episode when the Federation is freaking out about Dominion infiltrators, and he is against doing blood tests because he thinks that it undermines civil liberties. So although his sample size in the show is a little limited, he does a really good job with the time he has. And if we're just basing it on how well he does the role assigned to him, I would say he's a solid A. But because of the sort of lack of importance in most episodes, I'd go with a B. But now that I think about it, if you think about the prescience of that episode where about trading liberty for security and how that would become really relevant about 10 years after the episode was made, I'm going to have to elevate him to A just on that basis alone. So that one episode was one of the better ones in terms of exploring a moral quandary. And next up we have Jake Sisko, Ben's son, so he's an orphan. We don't really get very deep into his grief for his mother. We get more into his experiences growing up in this kind of multicultural environment as the son of a Starfleet officer. And like a lot of child actors, he will improve over time. So Jake will get better as time progresses, mostly because he's maturing, the actor is, that is. And especially when it becomes clear that he does not want to follow in his father's footsteps, or his grandfather's footsteps, but rather carve his own path as a writer, I think that's when he really takes off as a character. Now, again, I only saw this as an adult, but I was still able to relate a good deal to Jake because my own dad was in the military. And so, of course, I did not follow in his footsteps, so I can... And my grandparents also were not in the military for the most part. So when I look at the Sisko family, there's some stuff there that I can kind of relate to. And so I think Jake, as far as kid characters go, is one of the better ones in Trek so far. There haven't been all that many, but he's certainly superior to Wesley Crusher. Wesley Crusher was made into a prodigy. With Jake, he's not so much a prodigy. He is just kind of an average guy, someone who's fairly relatable. And his relationship with his father is interesting. Of course, there's the famous episode. I can't think of the name of it, but it's the one that won the all the awards, where his father was lost in an accident and Jake spent the rest of his life trying to bring him back. And that was one of the better tearjerker episodes. There aren't that many Star Trek episodes that attempt to be tearjerkers, but that one not only tried, but really nailed it. So with Jake, overall, most of his episodes are pretty mediocre. Most of his appearances aren't that interesting. So most of the time when he's in an episode that involves, say, Sisko's relationship with the Ferengi, his dad and then the Ferengi are more interesting. So I'm going to have to knock him down to a B, just because the quality of Jake's appearances can be a little limited. But when he's really good, he makes for some of the better episodes. Also that episode where the two Siskos from Deep Space Nine make the voyage on that light sail ship to Cardassia. That was pretty cool. Next up is the first officer from Deep Space Nine, the Bajoran Major and later Colonel, Kira Nerys. And what I've done is I started out with the Siskos, and now I'm moving to Bajorans, and I'm going to move race by race. So I didn't do all the humans together. I divided them up, but still, hopefully you can see the logic of what I did here. Kira is a Bajoran. Originally, the showrunners had planned on giving this role to Ro Laren, who would have transferred off of the Starship Enterprise and become the first officer on Deep Space Nine. And I'm actually glad that they went with Kira Nerys as well, because Nana Visitor is probably a better actress and also just made for a more, I think, relatable and appealing character when compared to Ro Laren. So Kira is a war veteran. She was basically a terrorist for a lot of her youth. Otherwise, she would have grown up to be in a guild of artists. She's also someone who is personally very religious, but because of her wartime experiences, she's also very worldly. She also has a longing for companionship, so she'll date a variety of people across the course of the show. And so, because of that, she has a lot of complexity. She can also be fairly temperamental, and she's not well suited for something as diplomatically challenging as running a space station that's multi-ethnic in this way. Because again, she spent most of her life on Bajor fighting against Cardassians, and it was a fairly black and white morality that she was engaged in, and now she's trying to adapt to a more civilian environment. That being said, I feel like they portray her pretty well, and even when she's trying to be charming, you can see that she's kind of under stress and a little bit tense, and I like the way that they do that because she's never quite relaxed. But despite, she's also a good example of someone who both adheres to some kind of rigid traditions, but does so fairly selectively. So she believes Sisko's the prophet, but at the same time, she doesn't follow some of the stricter teachings of her native religion, but she does take them seriously. So that will lead her into conflict with Wynn, who is a religious hypocrite. But, Kira will also respect some of the other religious leaders that she encounters. I'm actually a big fan of Kira. Of all the first officers in the Star Trek universe, she's one of my favorites. Although, just like with Sisko, I'm not sure if she's actually, like, if I were ranking them on skill or performance, I don't know how high I'd rank Kira. But as a character, she's excellent. And of course, when you have a fight going on, someone with that kind of experience is great to have around. So I would put Kira in the S tier as well. Next up, we have one of the early characters. That'd be Kai Opaka. So she is basically kind of like the Pope of the Bajoran religion. And she is the religious leader who came to power before the end of the Cardassian occupation and helped guide her people through the end phases of that and into the peace. She also helped them to make contact with the Federation and to help set that relationship up. She comes across as very serene and someone that you can follow, but at the same time, she does have some complexity to her. For instance, she was running some ops against the Cardassians, and she was engaged in some fairly tense diplomacy. She doesn't get quite enough screen time to fully develop, but it's also clear that she does have a kind of need to operate in a conflict zone. We also see that she is suffering badly from losing her son. Again, if she had lasted a little longer, I think she could have become one of the great characters. But actually, her premature death opens the way for, frankly, more interesting characters. I would give Kai Opaka a B. I liked her final episode pretty well, where she chose to be with some people who really needed her spiritual guidance. And yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with her arc. I think, of course, there are stronger characters, but she was pretty good. In general, I'm very pleased with the writing of this show. As I said, I very rarely watch a show twice, and this is one of the very rare exceptions to that. Interestingly enough, the only other shows I've watched more than once are the original series of Star Trek, which is, fairly short, and also Trailer Park Boys, which I've probably actually watched like 3 or 4 times. Alright, next up we have, what is his name? Vedic Bareil, there we go. So Vedic Bareil is one of the major figures. He is close with Opaka, and he is a rival of Kai Wynn. So basically, even though these terms I'm not sure exactly how accurate they'd be, but Bareil is kind of like the more liberal religious figure who's a little bit more, I guess you could say, metaphorical, and let's adapt our religion to the times rather than being strict. Whereas Wynn, his rival, is much more of a traditionalist who tries to hold people to account to the letter of the religion rather than the spirit. So because this Bareil is a little bit aloof, but at the same time he is more easygoing, and he is much more amenable to the Federation. So from the perspective that we have as viewers, we want Bajor and the Federation to be on very good terms, and so we naturally cheer for Bareil. He's also the love interest of Kira for quite a while, and so that adds another element. Bareil himself, however, is a little bit dull. He's not a very charismatic figure, so he's supposed to be based on the story, but it doesn't really shine through on the screen. And he also just doesn't come across as all that formidable of a figure. So with Opaka, she could have kind of a benevolent, semi-holy energy while also knowing how to get the job done, and Wynn will not challenge her because she knows better. Bareil just doesn't quite have that killer instinct. Even though he knows exactly what Wynn is, he won't really confront her. And again, like I said, he doesn't have that kind of presence that he's supposed to have based on the way that Kira and others react to him. So with Bareil, I actually find him a little disappointing. I'm going to actually put him down in the D tier. I was not entirely sad to see him go. If I was sad at all, it's just because I didn't like that happening for Kira. But in terms of it happening to Bareil, well, better men have died in Star Trek shows. Next up, we have one of the best sub-villains of the show, and this is, of course, Vedic Wynn, who later becomes Kai. She's played by Louise Fletcher, who also played Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the way that she plays a religious hypocrite and someone who uses religion as a vehicle to power, that is absolutely perfect. So just as Kira plays someone who's devout but also adapts to their time and lives a normal life, Wynn is someone who does a good job of pushing traditional religion while using it mostly for her own power. So both of them are very familiar figures in the world today, and probably every period you can think of. Wynn uses underhanded means to try to get her way, and she uses what would, I think by this time when it was being made, this term already existed, but she was a master of using culture wars. So she would go up to the station and start a bunch of shit about the teaching of science on the space station. And you might think it's weird to have religious figures protesting the teaching of science in an era where space travel is so easy and the existence of aliens is undeniable and and literally impossible to ignore. But Wynn does just that effectively by saying that only traditional Bajoran beliefs should be taught at DS9, which is in Bajoran space, even though it is Federation jurisdiction. So she will create a lot of problems for Sisko, and especially for Keiko O'Brien, who is the teacher involved. And actually, now that I think about it, Sisko's handling of this was a little more hands-off because he didn't want to get lured into a conflict with Wynn because he knew better, but at the same time, he didn't do the best job backing up the people who were trying to fight against what Wynn was working at. So Wynn was just trying to undermine the station. Later on, she will be corrupted by power. And it's clear from the way it's written and the way that she does the performance that she never sees herself as the bad guy. Her downfall is hubris and a desire for power. So in this way, she's a perfect villain. I would say she's actually a better villain than Ducat, who sometimes is really celebrated from this show. So in terms of just finding someone who is the dictionary definition of sanctimony and who is evil without intending it clearly, I have to say that Kai Wynn is one of my favorite characters in the show, and I reacted emotionally every time she appeared on screen because I knew some shit was about to go down and it was about to be devious. So S tier all the way for Kai Wynn. Excellent villain, and Louise Fletcher was one hell of an actress. Next up, we have Shakar Eden, or Eden. I mean, they mostly just call him Shakar, so I don't remember his last name too well. Anyway, he was a fellow soldier alongside of Kira during the Cardassian occupation. And the first time we meet him, Kira is sent by Wynn to resolve a dispute. So Wynn had not only wiggled her way into the Kai's seat once Bareil was dead, or actually no, she beat him politically and then had him killed effectively by demanding his help with a diplomatic mission when he was too ill to function. So she not only beat him and then got rid of him, then she was trying to take over the political system as well. And one of the ways that she was trying to do that is to crack down on these farmers, including Shakar, And then she sent Kira to help negotiate with him. Kira, of course, hates Wynn. Wynn was hoping things would go shitty, so that way she'd have an excuse to kill Kira and consolidate even more power. So once again, Wynn is one hell of a villain. And then Kira, who understands Wynn for what she is, because of that, is also a better protagonist for it. But Shakar is the man kind of caught in the middle here. So he is a stubborn dick. But at the same time, he does make some reasonable points about the freedom that they had fought for. So he's kind of like, I don't know, like a libertarian-esque figure in the story. Someone who kind of wants to revert to a more agrarian lifestyle, but not one ruled over by a combined political religious establishment. He's also against the harsh use of government power because Wynn was about to send in the stormtroopers and wipe them out. So Shakar, urged by Kira, enters politics and basically becomes the new prime minister, and he serves as a way to offset Wynn's power. So Shakar plays a useful role in the story, but just like a lot of Kira's other boyfriends, he's not as interesting as you would think he should be. He also goes from being a kind of mentor commander figure to being a lover of Kira, and that felt a little forced. And once, just like Bareil, he doesn't really have a ton of charisma. He's a little bit dull, at least after that first episode. So yeah, it's one of those things where there must be something about this guy because Kira, sees something in him, but at the same time, the viewer can't. So I think this is an example of a guy who either didn't get episodes that played to his strengths, or maybe the actor himself is just kind of eh. Anyway, I would also put him in the D tier alongside of Bareil. Something about Kira's boyfriends. They're just a little bit meh. Next up we have Lita, a Bajoran woman who works at Quark's bar and is sort of the Dabo girl. So Dabo is this random game that they play there. By the way, at one point there was a Quark's bar at Las Vegas, and I never got to go there because by the time I wanted to see Quark's bar and had an opportunity to go, it had been closed down for like 5 years. Anyway, apparently they had Dabo and probably a Morn thing set up and all kinds of shit. Anyway, Lita will later become the love interest of Rom, and she's played by Chase Masterson, so she's basically just very nice to look at, kind of nice and charming, open-minded, and that's really about it. There's not much more to say about her. To me, Lita is just kind of there. She's got a little bit more charisma than, say, Bareil or Shakar, almost forgot his name. But that's about it. And she doesn't really play that important of a role except to show that, nice guys can finish first, because Rom, who's kind of a little bit on the dorky side, is able to snag her as a wife. So it shows, she's open-minded and that Rom has qualities that someone can appreciate beyond his physical appearance and his material possessions. I'll put her up into the C tier. Well, I'm gonna go with D. Put her at the top of the D tier. I mean, mostly the Bajorans are a little dull, except for the main two Bajoran characters. Kira and Wynn are really up there for me, but these other Bajorans are not nearly as interesting. Next up, we have the most interesting and well-known Ferengi, Quark. So the Ferengi were introduced in TNG, and at that time they were seen as just greedy businessmen who were also piratical. But now we get to meet them more up close and get a better sense of their society. So Quark, like most good Ferengi men, wants to make a fortune, and become very powerful and wealthy, and have his lobes rubbed by beautiful women. And he will be held back by the fact that he's located now in Federation space, where things are not super capitalistic. And because Bajor is both kind of religious and also recovering from a long occupation, there aren't people coming up there to blow massive wads of money. The wormhole, of course, will boost his business, but for the most part, he is kind of a guy who feels like maybe he's a little bit of a failure. And so we get to see him struggle with his values and his identity a bit. And I feel like Quark's an underappreciated character because he's trying to be a hyper-capitalist while there are other forces pulling him away from that and showing him that there's more to life. And while he tries to resist, he can't help but be, in his words, corrupted by these other values. And at the end of the day, Quark always does have a fairly big heart. I mean, Quark's always the kind of guy who will do the right thing when either forced to or when people think that he won't. And then he's always touched when people actually stand up for him even after he tries to screw them over. So Quark is an interesting guy, and I think he's a really fun character. I mean, some of the most fun episodes have Quark in them, and the back and forth between Quark and Odo is great. In general, anytime Quark's on the screen, it's usually pretty fun. So for me, Quark is an S tier character. I enjoy Quark a good deal. Now, when it comes to his brother Rom is not someone who is naturally gifted at business, because Rom is an honest, straightforward guy. So Quark will call him stupid. But in fact, we learn as time goes on, Rom is just being poorly utilized by his brother, because Rom's abilities are in the areas of repair and engineering. So once Rom finds his true calling, he then starts to really prosper as a repairman working under Chief O'Brien. And so Rom comes into his own, and he also learns to stand up to his brother. So when his brother is trying to determine Rom's son's future, Rom will stand up to Quark and basically tell him that he's about to kick his ass if he interferes with Nog anymore. And Quark is forced to respect his younger, poorer brother. Rom, of course, in the end, not only gets the girl Lita, but he then becomes the Grand Nagus, which means that a guy who doesn't really believe in hypercapitalism is put in charge of a hypercapitalist society. That's one thing I'm hoping in this new season of Star Trek Picard, they at least acknowledge in passing this major shift in Ferengi society now that you have someone like Rom as the Grand Nagus. I mean, did the experiment work? Is he still in power? Did he get overthrown? Has he enacted any major reforms? What happened? I would love to know. In the meantime, I'll put Rom in the B tier. I feel like he is a pretty solid character, but not truly great. And then we have his son, Nog. So, Nog and Jake have an interesting relationship. So Nog, of course, is Quark's nephew and Rom's son. And much like Jake, he is half-orphaned, so he only has one parent. And the two of them strike up a friendship. And the thing is, both of their parental figures are suspicious of it. Especially Sisko, who is clearly racist against the Ferengi. And he's afraid that Jake will pick up bad habits from Nog. So he tries to discourage Nog from hanging out, Jake from hanging out with Nog, I mean. And actually the way that Sisko plays a racist when it comes to the Ferengi is perfect. It's absolutely perfect, because he doesn't come out right and make a big speech about it. You can just tell by the distaste and his careful word choice and his tone that he doesn't like the Ferengi. He doesn't come out and say it. It's just there, and you know it. And that will lead to some interesting confrontations between Quark and Sisko later on, when Quark inserts himself into a camping trip where Nog has already gotten invited and Sisko is clearly already pissed, and then Quark shows up. But anyway, Nog will have a very interesting evolution as a character. So at first, he's kind of annoying. He plays an interesting role, and he shows the diversity on the station. He's involved in some of those religious disputes and things like that. And also the idea of how much education do I need as a Ferengi? All I need to know are my numbers. And then he transforms after he's inspired by his father. So once his father finds his way and starts working on machines, Nog is now inspired to pursue his first best destiny, to borrow a line from Wrath of Khan. And he tries to go into Starfleet. And because Sisko is the guy he needs a letter of recommendation from, he has to win over Sisko, who doesn't like him very much. So he does have a tearful approach to Sisko. That's one of the better moments in the show, where he goes to Cisco and wins him over by talking about his father's struggles to fit in with Ferengi society and how he wants to learn from that. And then he comes back to the station. He's become gung-ho for Starfleet. Then he gets wounded badly in the war and has sort of a PTSD cycle that's pretty interesting. Some people found it annoying, but I personally didn't. Anyway, I really enjoyed Nog. I don't think he's S tier, but he's definitely A tier. And also R.I.P. to the actor who played him. He died young. I think he was a little under 50, and he died within the last few years. But he did an excellent job, and Nog was a great character. The actor was already suffering from some pretty bad health problems by the time the show was made, by the way. So he was doing all of this with either his liver or kidneys or something failing him. So, all the respect in the world for the performance that he put out. Next up, we have Sean Wallace's character, the Grand Nagus Zek.
He. Quark, my boy.
Look, Zek is great. I also love that he has an affair with Quark and Rom's mother. So he appears in several episodes, and anytime the Grand Nagus shows up, he kind of uses his position to butt in on other people's business deals. So on the one hand, it does show that Quark has kind of enhanced his standing. He's gone from just being a provincial bar owner to someone who now has the attention of kind of like the Chamber of Commerce / government head. So this is important for Quark, and also just the amount of greed for the Grand Nagus, and just anything involving Sean Wallace is just awesome. He doesn't appear in quite enough episodes for me to put him in S tier. I don't know if he would quite be S tier just because he doesn't really move the plot forward overall. So the Ferengi don't play a huge role in, say, the Dominion War. But he is a fun character, and it's also fun to see, especially in today's climate, the last, call it 5-6 years, to see sort of a clearly senile leader struggling to hang on and not really having a firm grasp of what he's doing, but doing it anyway. I will put Grand Nagus Zek in the A tier. I really enjoyed him. He's probably the funniest character. Actually, the Ferengi are the best for comedy in this show. I mean, all 5 of the Ferengi characters are fucking hilarious. And next up, we have one of the 2 characters by Jeffrey Combs, and that is Inspector Brunt, or is it Auditor Brunt? I forget what his exact title is, but anyway, the idea is that he does audits. He's basically the tax man of the Ferengi. Although I'm not sure if they quite believe in taxes. I can't quite recall what his job title is. But the point is that he can do inspections of different Ferengi to make sure that their businesses adhere to Ferengi norms. So rather than looking to see if the Ferengi are following laws that protect people, he makes sure they follow laws that fuck people over. So for instance, Quark at one point is more or less forced into creating a union, or allowing a union, and then Brunt shows up to basically punish him for it. And the thing about officials like Brunt is that he is looking for power ultimately, so he wants to be Nagus, and he also is looking for bribes, because that's how the Ferengi society works. You bribe people. When you die, you even bribe the Grand Treasury, so that way you get a good afterlife. So anyway, Brunt is a very intrusive and obnoxious character, so he plays kind of an overpowered, corrupt bureaucrat really well. He doesn't have a ton of screen time, though, and because he appears frequently in the company of guys like Quark and Zek, he doesn't necessarily stand out as much. So I'm going to put him in the B tier. Again, pretty good character, but not truly elite. Next up, we have Worf, son of Moog, of House Martok. Worf was already an established character from Star Trek The Next Generation. He then moves to DS9. And I think most of the best Worf moments are from DS9. So he does have some good moments on TNG, like the one episode where Q is fucking with the crew and he's dressed them up like Robin Hood characters. And then he says, Picard, you and your men, you're Robin Hood and his merry men. And Worf says, I must protest, sir. I am not a merry man. But otherwise, most of the other great Worf moments, whether comedic or action, are in DS9. I mean, Worf, famously, when he meets Martok, he's at a POW camp, and he established himself as a true badass warrior by defeating about 7 or 8 Jem'Hadar warriors in combat, one after the next. And so Worf really establishes his badass bona fides. He also develops an interesting relationship with Sisko. And apparently he's intimidated by Sisko, which is interesting. He also, of course, will have a love match with Jadzia Dax, who has been the interest of every man on the station up to this point. And it's only Worf that wins her over. And they have a very physical relationship where they batter each other endlessly. So Worf has that. The Klingon wedding stuff is fantastic. Some of the better comedy episodes in the show. He also goes through the grief of losing Jadzia. And I like the way they handle that because, I mean, he still has some of that aggression in him. Because over time, his evolution is that his aggression goes down from TNG into DS9 and from the middle of DS9 when he joins until the end. So he's not quite as aggressive or ready to rumble at all times. He becomes a little bit more selective. But I do like the way that he handled the death of his wife. And but probably his best moment is when he decides to stand up for his good friend Martok and to fight Gowron. So he kills Gowron, the Chancellor, and rather than taking power for himself, he realized that his friend Martok would be the better leader, so he gave power to Martok. For me, Worf has to be S tier, and I would not rank him S tier for TNG. In fact, in TNG, he's probably only about B tier. But here in DS9, he really thrived. And it's unfortunate there are so many people who only watch TNG and not DS9, because I don't feel like they know the true extent of how great Worf really is. Alright, next up we have General Martok. So Martok is a self-made man among the Klingons. He rose from obscure origins in a society where aristocracy is highly valued. Every other Klingon we meet is from some great house or other. Martok's not from any of them. But he has made it on his own. He has some sort of a feud with either Kor or Kang or one of those sort of ancient Klingons who appeared in TOS and then reappeared in Deep Space Nine as old friends of Dax. And anyway, so Martok has a huge chip on his shoulder because he is a self-made man and he hates the aristocracy. And that actually leads him to treat these old heroes of the Klingon Empire unfairly because they treated him unfairly when he's a cadet. So Martok absolutely can hold a grudge. And that is an interesting character trait because most of the characters we meet in DS9 and in the Star Trek universe in general are noble and they'll ultimately do the right thing. But Martok doesn't always do that because he's a Klingon. But that being said, even though he is a Klingon, he's also kind of chill. So even though he's got the big chip on his shoulder about class stuff, he's also not going to start a bar fight with somebody. He'll sit and have a drink with somebody, have a reasonable discussion for the most part, have a good laugh, he has a good sense of humor, and he's actually pretty adept at diplomacy when he's dealing with other races. So Martok is a multi-talented guy. He's also made of sacrifices for the Empire. He's lost an eye. And while he is willing to fight to the death, he's also bound by loyalty to the Empire. So even though he knows Gowron is trying to undermine him, he will not turn traitor on Gowron. My favorite Martok moment, though, is at the end of the Dominion War. He goes to Cardassia, and they're surrounded by all these corpses of both Dominion and Cardassian troops, and he's there with, I believe it's Admiral Ross and Sisko and maybe some Romulan or something, and they're discussing whether they should have a drink or not, and the other people are disgusted by the fact that they're surrounded by bodies, and Martok's like, well, fuck it, let's bring out some blood wine and celebrate. So just the Klingon bloodthirstiness of Martok is amazing. And you know what, it's my list. I'm gonna put him in S tier as well. He's probably really more of an A, but fuck it, he's going in S tier. I don't care. Alright, next up is Gowron. If I'm not mistaken, Gowron became Chancellor in TNG. And a lot of the Klingon storylines carry over because they follow Worf. So Klingons have a big presence in DS9 after Worf joins. So Gowron's mostly been in the background, and then he comes back. And Gowron is this like large-eyed, very expressive character. He is a political opportunist, and although he is an underhanded son of a bitch, he's not a coward. He will fight you. He's not afraid of anyone. But he's also not that great of a fighter. So this shows how adept of a politician he is, that in a society where your ability to win a duel is at a premium and he's not very good at that, he's still able to be chancellor. And he think he's also the guy who's responsible for creating the clone of Kahless and stuff like that. So I mean, Gowron is a fairly clever man, but also a piece of shit and not necessarily a very good commander in chief. So he's deeply flawed in many ways. But on the limited screen time he gets, he always dominates because he is the scene-chewing villain in many ways because of his presence and those large expressive eyes and over-the-top mannerisms that he has. Of course, he will get himself killed by Worf because he's trying to fuck with Martok too much. I'll put Gowron in the A tier. I really enjoy Gowron. I wish there had been a little bit more Gowron. So if I could have... Let's see, who would I... Yeah, Gowron should have gotten more screen time. Who would I take screen time away from? Damn, I don't know. I mean, a lot of the characters are really good. I can't think of too many people I'd want to see less of. I mean, maybe the secondary Bajorans, we could, take 10 or 15, 20 minutes up from them and give it to Gowron. Meanwhile, back at Klingon headquarters on Kronos, here's Gowron barking orders at people and losing his shit. Next up, we have Morn. He was a bar regular. I believe the Morn meme is basically a joke from Cheers, because there was some guy who was always in the bar at the same seat. But I haven't watched a lot of Cheers, so I think maybe that's like Norm? I don't know the character's name. Anyway, Morn is sort of an unknown species. He's some sort of deep space shipper, but also he's always at Quark's bar. And the joke is that no one ever talks to this guy. In the show, I mean. But they always mention him in passing, like, yeah, I'm going to go hang out with Morn. Yeah, I got drunk last night with Morn. He told the craziest story. But every time we see him, he's just like a large puppet, or maybe there's a guy in a suit, but Morn never delivers a single line of dialogue. There's even a whole episode when people thought he was dead, and they were having a tribute to Morn. I'm glad that they stuck with the bit and didn't destroy it by having Morn be an actual real character. I'm glad they kept him as just a beloved NPC. So I'll go with the C for Morn. I mean, the idea of Morn is interesting, and of course it doesn't go too far, but still, it's kind of a fun little meme, but he doesn't really add much beyond a little bit of color to the setting of Quark's bar. Next up, we have Vic Fontaine, baby, the Vegas host, because they created a one holodeck suite that was always at Fontaine's casino. So he's kind of this easygoing, charismatic host who will sing and put on performance. One interesting episode they had is where Sisko knew the history of Vegas and how it used to be segregated, so he refused to attend because at the time that Fontaine's simulation is set, Vegas was still segregated, because I think Fontaine's from the 50s or 60s. Anyway, eventually Sisko gets over it because he realizes that, yeah, the simulation is not going to bring the racism part of the simulation, so he lets it go and has a good time. And they have like a little Ocean's 11 episode where they help Fontaine defeat some villains in this game. Overall, Fontaine usually gets hated on by a lot of people, but I don't think he's that egregious. I think the setting that they had is interesting, and the idea of having sort of a bar within a bar, and sort of the simulation they can all share and experience together as both the crew and sort of the civilian population. I think that's an interesting concept, and it is a pretty good way to build camaraderie. So I think that just the idea of Fontaine is pretty good. The execution was okay. I believe the guy, Darren whatever, is mostly in the show because he's friends with somebody. But he does an okay job. He kind of has the look and feel of a Vegas performer. Maybe one of the more minor casinos, or one of the ones that couldn't recruit, say, I don't know, Elton John or whoever the fuck would go with this guy. I'll I'll put him in the C tier. He's not bad, but at the same time, he's not great. He's good in that one Nog episode where he helps Nog try to rehab and just is sort of a buddy to Nog while he's, really going through a lot of psychological shit after losing his leg and all that. Now we move on to the Cardassian characters. And of course, Fontaine is not human, he is a simulation. Morn is an unknown species. Now we move on to the Cardassians. So, for all practical intents and purposes, the Cardassians are space Nazis. That's the best way to put it. Their culture is very authoritarian. They do not believe much in individuality. Their trials literally are decided before they're held, and they take pride in that. They believe themselves to be culturally superior to everyone else. Their architecture is very dark. So basically, DS9 has a modern look to it because now everything is about dark mode. If you look at the modern Treks, they're very dark. DS9 was criticized at the time for not being bright enough. But it was just, 20 some years ahead of its time. Nearly 30 at this point. And there are several major Cardassian characters, at least two, I'd say 2.5 big ones. First up, we have Gul Dukat, who is a leading bad guy from beginning to end. So we meet him at the beginning, and he's always present in some way, form, or fashion. He had been the previous commander at Terok Nor before it became DS9, so he oversaw many of the horrors on Bajor. He also is someone whose career has been really fucked over by the loss of Bajor, and so he holds that against the Federation. He also has kind of a passive-aggressive relationship with Sisko, where he has a lot of fake friendliness that barely conceals his hostility and his intentions to take back Terok Nor. He also is unhinged and delusional, which might sound like the norm for a Cardassian, because, let's face it, these are fucking space Nazis. But Dukat takes things to a different level. So he's much like Gowron, except less politically successful. And over the course of the show, Dukat will steadily lose track of reality. Now, this leads him at first, as he sort of ventures away from being an uptight Cardassian official, to actually doing a few things that are semi-moral or admirable. So he gives Sisko credit, for instance, for being able to recreate the flight of the Bajorans to Cardassia. So he will sometimes be generous with credit, or something like that, but for the most part, he is a ruthless individual. He does not do much to connect with his daughter, Zial. He also will justify all the things that he did on Bajor. And in many ways, I feel like to really do the full arc of Dukat the way that it was supposed to be done, you would actually need one more season of DS9 to really trace his mental degradation. Because I feel like his degradation accelerated a little too quickly, and then he just became a fucking lunatic way too fast. So he will side with the gods, or not gods, but wormhole aliens who got trapped on Bajor, and try to create an unholy alliance with Wynn and with the Dominion after he's basically ousted by the Dominion. So he kind of does his own thing as a villain, which I respect. That being said, his final descent into madness was a little too much. It was a little too cartoonish. Like Cobra Commander levels of shit. And again, if there had been another season of him slowly falling apart and becoming more erratic, I would buy it more. That being said, it's still a very good arc overall. I like Dukat. He's entertaining. And I like how he has multiple moods and sort of settings, because there are some scenes where he's very under control and even clearly attempting to be diplomatic. There are other scenes where he's completely being a psychotic asshole. There are other scenes where he's fucking insane. That being said, the acceleration, like I said, a little too fast. But that happens with a lot of shows toward the end as they're trying to wrap things up. They'll just kind of skip a step or two and hope you don't notice. Now we have Damar, who for most of his run in DS9 is Dukat's second in command. Damar is more of the consummate professional Cardassian, and for most of his early appearances, he comes across as rather boring. So he's just the kind of guy who was kind of there. He doesn't really do that much. But then, as Ducat starts to deteriorate, we see Damar step up. He's very confident and competent. He also is ruthless and has a twisted sense of humor. So, for instance, he murdered a number of Wayuns, and the new Wayuns would ask him about it, and he would basically admit it without quite admitting it. So he'd phrase his answer in a way that made it clear that he did it, but without confessing anything. So Damar kind of plays the blunt soldier very well. So if we think about Ducat as kind of like a Nazi officer, then Damar would be kind of like the Prussian aristocrat who's not quite on board with Nazism, but is not going to revolt against it either. So he's more rational and grounded, and he's willing to countenance evil, even though if he were in charge, he probably wouldn't be doing this stuff. That being said, if somebody else is in charge, he's absolutely following orders. So Damar, if we think about the Nazi analogy, is actually a very good character, and he's not A tier, but he's very high B tier. Damar is pretty solid. Next up, we have Anabran Tain, a senior official with the Obsidian Order, the Cardassian Intelligence Service, and the father of Elam Garak, one of the more interesting characters. So Anabran Tain does not appear too often, but when he does, he is kind of an old man who is not what he used to be. So at one point he was this great devious figure, and now because of age and everything else, he just isn't what he once was. So Anabran Tain, his main significance, of course, is being Garak's father. He's okay on the screen. He's not great. He just, again, partly it's because his character is washed by the time he shows up. He's trying to regain power and uncover something, and his mission, while in theory not a bad one, fails horrifically, and it shows again that there's a reason why he's no longer in charge of the Obsidian Orders, because he's lost a step or two or three. And this is a case where it's not so much like dementia, it's just the man's too fucking old for the job. I'll put him in the C tier. He's somewhat interesting, but I'm actually glad we don't have to deal with him more, because they already established him as being a little too nerfed and past his prime to really be formidable, and I don't want to see a sad old Cardassian shuffling around, looking for a higher position in what amounts to the Nazi party. Next up, we have Elam Garak. So Garak is the Cardassian left on board DS9. Pretty much everybody on board suspects him of being a spy. He's actually not, though, even though he does have ties with the Obsidian Order and his father was the head of it. Garak is very secretive, and he is a very skilled assassin as well, as we learned, but he's also a tailor and a spinner of great yarns. So Garak has a very sort of roguish energy about him, where there's some surface charm, but it's always very menacing. And at first he was intended to be a minor character in Season 1 and then to be gotten rid of in some way, but because he was so popular with fans, and the actor is an experienced actor who's been in a bunch of movies, they decided to keep him around, and he did a great deal for Dr. Bashir, who we'll talk about later, but most of Bashir's best moments, just a lot of them, are Garak scenes. So Garak has these great dialogue exchanges with Bashir and others. He also has great chemistry with Odo, because the two of them really go back and forth against one another. And in the later seasons, when they're at war, he will play a pivotal role, because he is very good at devious stuff. And as we'll see, when he gets released onto missions with a weapon, he just goes around and starts stacking bodies, because Garak is actually a raging badass. Now, he's involved in a couple of really interesting episodes, two of which are about his guilt, and one about his guilt of being sort of a failure and an outcast, no longer belongs, where he becomes addicted to this drug he had. There's another episode where there's another episode where he becomes friends with Zial, the sort of orphan daughter of Ducat. So that shows that he does have this sort of human side to him. Both of these episodes where he's vulnerable and shows some humanity, or whatever, Cardassianity. I don't know what the term would be. And there's also an episode where he can't remember. I'm just going to get to the one where everybody knows what he does. He helps Cisco to blow up a shuttle to bring the Romulans into the war. So he's an underhanded guy. He's very good at that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he is a genuine patriot. Oh, yeah, it's the guilt episode. So there's another episode where he has basically a meltdown because he is so guilty about betraying Cardassia to work with the Federation. But he also knows he has to work with the Federation because Cardassia has gone so far off the path of what is remotely close to being right. So he willingly plays a traitor and psychologically is being destroyed by it. I love Garrick. Garrick is one of the best characters. He might be the best character. I don't know, but he's definitely in the running. For me, he's an automatic S tier. Alright, so next we have Zial, the daughter of Dukat, and I believe her mother is Bajoran. So she is a war orphan. And because Bajor suffered so horrifically by the Cardassians, half Cardassian orphans are not very welcome. Now, they do technically provide for them, but it's clear the Bajorans would rather them be gone. But then the problem is, where do they go? Cardassia is racist as fuck, and they want to. All the soldiers who served there want to pretend that they never sired bastard children while they were off in Bajor. So Zial is kind of stuck in no man's land, and that lands her up in DS9 for a while. Later, Dukat will take her. And then, because he is falling apart mentally, that will get her killed and also damages his career, which further undermines his mental state. Zial just doesn't really get quite enough chances to shine. She is a very charming character, and she even establishes an unlikely friendship with the spy/murderer Garrick, of all people. So, that is interesting as a pairing, just because she wanted to be around another Cardassian in a mud bath or whatever it was. Zial had potential, but it was never quite realized. And I did like how, this sort of vulnerable teenage orphan does kind of start winning over friends. So I think she won over Kira and Cisco and especially Garrick. But ultimately she doesn't do enough or stick around long enough, so she's only going to be in the C tier. And now we get to Jadzia Dax, the first major Trill character. So Trills were introduced in TNG, and the idea is that they have at least the joined Trills have a slug inside of them, and that slug holds the memories of previous Trill host. And so Jadzia has the memories of 7 or 8 other people inside of her. And there's an episode where they're all brought out to talk to her, including Curzon Dax, her immediate predecessor, who was actually Cisco's mentor when he was a young man. So because of that, Cisco will call Dax old man, even though she's a young woman. Jadzia is an interesting character. She's actually a little boring at first. So at first, she's very kind of just a science officer who stays at her station and has a few good jokes here and there, and kind of has this good repertoire of Cisco, and that's about it. But over time, because the actress herself is fairly athletic, what you see is that she becomes more involved in action scenes. And then later on, she will become the romantic interest of Worf, and they even get married. I think that Jadzia is a good character. She's got a fair amount of charisma, and she's got some good lines, and she's also a pretty good flirt, because if you think about the station, there's really only a handful of attractive single women around, and Jadzia is pretty much at the top of the pack, especially since Kira pretty much only dates Bajorans, and then Odo later. So Jadzia kind of plays the field. I think she also hooks up with Morn at one point. So I love how Jadzia fucks Morn, but never gets near Bashir. That's one of the most fun details of the whole show. Anyway, Jadzia, for me, is an A. Good character. I think she's a little overrated, to be honest, because I think most people would probably put her in the S tier, and some people might even say she's the best character. But I think she's certainly a good character, just not quite S tier. And now we have the most controversial character from the show, her replacement, Ezri Dax. So Jadzia was in the first 6 seasons, and then her contract expired, the actress in real life, so they kill off the character, and then they have the slug transferred to another Trill who ends up on DS9 as a counselor, and that is Ezri Dax. Now, Esri is mostly unpopular, but I actually think, given the limited time that she had, she does a good job of going through the issues someone would have, because she did not know going into this that any trill can join, because the trill were super selective about who got to have a slug. I don't know what the actual term is, I can't remember, but anyway, so the trill have a tradition that only if you go through all this intensive training and this long examination process that you're eligible. But it turns out literally any trill can take a slug. And so Esri is the only trill around when Jadzia dies, and the slug won't make it unless it has a new host. Therefore, they just stick it in her, mostly without her permission, and now she is Dax. And she's very uncomfortable with it, so Cisco basically has to give her a tough talk when she arrives on the station. But I think Esri is actually a good character, because she shows what it would be like to have this sudden revelation that not only is this thing you've always thought it's impossible possible, but you're going to be the example of it, and now you got all these voices in your head that you didn't want or anticipate, and you also have the high bar of living up to Jadzia Dax, who was a hero on this station. So she's got to deal with the fact that Worf still has feelings for her, kind of, and she might have some Jadzia era feelings for him a little bit, but she's not in the Klingons because she's much more sort of feminine and sort of pixie-like than Jadzia, who's much more sort of athletic and, you know, enjoyed fighting as foreplay with Worf. So, you know, she's a much different character, and she's dealing with the fact that people expect certain things of her that she can't deliver. But also, she is a counselor in a time of war, which is pretty useful. And it turns out that she has some pretty good advice for Worf, because Worf will be unhappy with the direction of the Klingons, and she basically is the one who points out to him, look, I have all these memories from Curzon, who was an expert in the Klingons, and it turns out, I mean, the Klingons have sucked dick for years. I mean, their leadership is a total joke. It's a train wreck. And I don't know, I find Esri to be a likable character and a worthy successor of Jadzia. I'll put her in the B tier. With more time, I think she could have actually been as good or better. I mean, a little bit of a hot take, but there you have it. Now we have Eddington. He was, I believe, a major. That's not a Star Trek rank. Lieutenant commander. Anyway, Eddington was a security officer who kind of replaced Odo for a bit. So now we're in the humans. And at first, he just appears to be kind of a competent professional, not too fancy. And then he defected from Starfleet to join the Maquis. And when he defects, it turns out that this guy's got a huge fucking ego. So he kind of seems like a boring, balding guy. So you don't usually think of somebody who's looks like him, frankly, as being a romantic. But it turns out that he sees himself in a very elevated light, that he thinks of himself as kind of a poet warrior. And so he's got a lot of douchebaggery going for him, but in a way that's really fun, not so much because he sells it well, but because it pisses Cisco off to the nth degree. Because unlike Picard, who kind of keeps it in control a little bit, even if he goes on a self-righteous rant, Cisco will literally start punching the fucking wall if you get under his skin. And so the great thing about Eddington is that he is the perfect foil for Cisco. Because it's this guy who has no charisma, who thinks he does, and thinks like he's a ladies' man and a romantic figure. He thinks he's like Lord Byron or some shit. And he gets away with this and consistently gets away from Cisco. And Cisco just flies into rages. Which again shows Cisco's vulnerability and complexity, while also just revealing what a great troll Eddington is. But if you think about it, if you were someone who did think that Star Trek had lost its, or not Star Trek, but Starfleet had lost its way, and you're going to join the Maquis to fight the Cardassians and fight injustice, that absolutely might be the way someone acts. So someone who normally is a boring by-the-book professional now acts like, you know, a revolutionary figure, someone who's got a lot of swag. And so actually, I really like Eddington. He's a great sort of anti-hero. I can't call him a villain because his cause is a pretty good one. The Maquis are not really villains. I'm actually going to give Eddington an A. I like Eddington a great deal. Now we have Cassidy Yates, the love interest of Cisco. Honestly, she sucks. I don't know how else to put it. She's boring as shit. There's not much to say about Cassidy Yates. She's not interesting. It's kind of a forced romance where Jake kind of arranges for her to meet his dad. They hit it off. Cassidy doesn't really bring much to the table. She's just kind of there at dinner. I don't know. I didn't get into that relationship. Cassidy's an E. Not really much else to say. Now we have the next character, who is Admiral Ross. So Ross is the guy who kind of oversees Cisco and will become a huge figure once the Dominion War gets going. So he monitors the wormhole from afar and later will lead battle groups against the Cardassians and Dominion. Ross is not a bad officer by any means. He gives Cisco support. He also treats Cisco with respect, so he's a good admiral. He doesn't try to overstep his bounds. He even takes Cisco away from the Defiant for a while to be his aide-de-camp because he needs someone who's experienced and competent to fill that role. But he does it for reasons that actually make sense and not as a jealousy move, because a lot of times when admirals come in and screw with the captains in Star Trek, it's because they either miss the command chair or because they're jealous and petty or they have some sort of wacko agenda. But Ross is actually a good guy. That being said, Ross is not that great of a character. Now, if I were rating him as an admiral, he'd be pretty good, based on what we do see, which is not, admittedly, not that much. We don't really have a good feel for how much Ross actually does planning. They give us the impression that Cisco is responsible for a lot of the plans and then a lot of the leading in battle. That being said, Ross is not a bad character, and I do like the idea of kind of a competent, responsible, good-hearted admiral. That being said, Ross is a little on the boring side, and he's a C. So he's kind of like Cornwell in the more recent Star Trek, who has some flaws, but ultimately is a sympathetic and likable character. Is Cornwell Discovery or Strange New Worlds? I can't even remember. One of the new Treks. Who gives a shit? Let's look it up real fast, just so I can resolve this before it drives me crazy. The new Treks are not as good, of course, but they're not terrible. Discovery, okay, that's what I thought. So anyway, yeah, so he's kind of like the Cornwell of DS9. Next up we have the Section 31 guy. God damn it, what was his name? Let's look it up real fast. I should have written this down, because I knew most of these guys by memory. Section 31 leader. So I'm going to feel like an idiot when I see this. Luther Sloan. Sloan, there we go. So Sloan is kind of a semi-rogue agent. He's very interesting because he works for an organization that has gone underground. Section 31, so it's in the sort of Federation charter. It's a step beyond Starfleet intelligence because he works strictly off the books. So he's kind of like the black budget guy within Starfleet, or maybe outside of Starfleet. Think of him less as the CIA and more as, I'm trying to think what would be beyond the CIA in terms of secrecy. I can't really think of anything. Like, how about in the X-Files universe, the cigarette smoking man? That's basically what Sloan is, except because it's the future, he doesn't smoke. He takes care of his health. So Sloan is this nefarious figure who thinks he's a good guy for sure and does a lot of morally ambiguous stuff. He also tries to recruit Bashir, and that's an interesting arc for both of them. He more or less justifies what he does by saying that there are a lot of really good-hearted but somewhat self-righteous figures within Starfleet, and that what he does protects them and makes their work possible. While I don't really like what Sloan stands for, I think he stands for it very well. So I think that he makes a pretty good case for having sort of a secret, underhanded organization, kind of like the special operations branch of the CIA that relies on a black budget. So I guess another fictional character he'd be a little bit like would be like Mitch Rapp. But except less of an assassin and more of a director. So Sterling Archer's mom in Archer, except, not as funny. But actually, I like Sloane as a character. He's very nefarious, and he does have some mystery about him that's never quite resolved, and I like that. They never learn a whole lot about this guy. And even Ross doesn't know all the details about Section 31, so he and Cisco investigate. And Bashir takes part in that, which again is one of the more interesting things Bashir does. Next up, we have the chief engineer on DS9, the experienced teleport operator, Miles O'Brien. Now, Miles, they try to make him out to be more of an NCO than an officer. That's something I've never understood in Star Trek, though, is what are the non-com ranks? So I know he's a chief, which is a high-ranking one. But where are the other non-coms? Because anytime else they just find some random young person, they'll be like, ensign so-and-so, and ensigns are officers. So where are the other, I don't know, spacemen? And oh, by the way, with the formation of Space Force, that is a real fucking rank now. There are people on the United States government's payroll serving in the armed forces called spacemen. What a fucking world we live in. Spaceman. It's the stupidest fucking name for a... Anyway, let's not get into that. Okay, so Miles O'Brien, of course, is famous in this show for his ability to suffer and get tortured. So back in TNG, he didn't really have a big role. He was just an operator in the teleporter room, and now he wanted a bigger challenge, so he transferred to DS9. He's a family man, so he and his wife Keiko and their daughter are all present. And Miles is less accomplished than his wife. So their dynamic as a couple, I think, is very interesting. And probably the most interesting thing about O'Brien is his relationship with his wife Keiko. Because the two of them face a problem that a lot of couples face. Not only do they have a disparity in their education levels, but also their career interests are divergent. And ultimately, his career interests take precedence over hers, even though she is the one who is clearly the more accomplished of the two of them, quite frankly. Now, I know in the show, because O'Brien is Starfleet, and because he also is this guy who can take a licking and keep on ticking, we want to side with him more. But if we think about it more broadly, it's actually Keiko who has the more interesting and important career, frankly, and would be the harder of the two to replace. That being said, maybe that's not even right, though, because O'Brien, because of his mechanical wizardry, is able to operate this complex DS9 where you have all kinds of circuitry that's not supposed to go together working. So he can put Federation and Cardassian parts together and jury-rig things to work. As a character, O'Brien is kind of the everyman, kind of a working man. I don't think he's interesting on his own, but where he is interesting is when he's either with his wife or with Julian Bashir. So all of his best friends are people who are basically like PhDs. He's like the equivalent of a guy who never went to college, but then his wife and his best friend are functionally like PhDs or MDs. So I'm not sure what Keiko's exact qualifications are, but anyway, so I've always found it interesting about O'Brien. And so he does feel like he's been condescended to by Julian. There's also an age gap because Julian's in his 20s, Miles is probably about 40. And so Miles has a little bit of an inferiority complex because of the education gap. But then Julian wants to be accepted by this guy who he respects and looks up to in some way. So they do eventually become kind of an oddball couple of best friends. But that being said, O'Brien, just on his own, is not super interesting. And also, he's one of the... If you look at what he goes through, I mean, Starfleet's policy toward taking mental health breaks is fucked up. Because O'Brien really should have had some serious vacation time after some of the shit he went through. I feel like it's, every other episode where he gets captured and tortured, or some soldier beside him gets blown up or some shit. I mean, terrible things happen to O'Brien. He is sort of like the Odysseus of Deep Space Nine. O'Brien's a little hard to rank. I like the guy a lot, but I feel like most of what's interesting about him comes from his relationships with others. So the relationship he has with Cisco, because O'Brien tells every captain he works under, so both Picard and Cisco, that they're the best captain ever. I'll put him in the B tier. I like O'Brien a lot, but again, I feel like his most interesting work is with his wife and then with Bashir. So Keiko O'Brien sometimes is, I think, underrated because she doesn't appear all that often, but she is kind of the military spouse and the only one we really get to know. So we know again that she was a botanist or something by trade. So she's kind of like a PhD level researcher, and she's married to a guy who is a non-com. So they have kind of an oddball relationship already. Well, not oddball, but they have a sort of unusual relationship already. They have a child together, and now her husband wants to go to DS9, but that is terrible for her career because it's going to really slow her down. Because she needs to be in places where there's either a bunch of exotic stuff to study or where there's a research institute. So this creates a lot of strain in their marriage. And Keiko, I think, and O'Brien both handle it pretty well overall. So she tries to switch careers. She tries to become a teacher at one point. She runs into religious fanatics. And I think she handled herself very bravely in that scenario where she stood up to Kai Wen, or Vedic Wen at the time. Later on, she'll mostly work on Bajor, so this creates a little bit of tension between her and Miles. So they do have a troubled marriage, and she also has to compete with Bashir for time with Miles. But she realizes that her husband has a stressful job and that he needs to bond with his coworkers. So she's all right if he goes and fucks around in the holodeck with Bashir for a while playing fighter pilots or whatever. And then they also have an interesting arc where, for whatever reason, they have Kira carry their child. And I think the only reason is because the actress who plays Kira was pregnant in real life with Bashir's baby, the guy who plays Bashir's baby, by the way. And so they wanted to work that into the storyline. So the storyline is that she's a surrogate mother, even though she's not human, for the O'Briens to have a second child. And also the chemistry when Kira is working closely with them is also interesting. And Keiko becomes jealous of O'Brien's friendship with Kira. And anyway, I actually think Keiko is a better character than most people give her credit for. And I'll give her a B as well. I think she's actually a very good character. Now we get on to Julian Bashir. Bashir comes across originally as a total and complete asshole. So Bashir in the early, especially the first season, talks about doing frontier medicine, and he's just kind of like an upper class, out of touch douchebag who clearly thinks he's hot shit. He thinks he's going to hook up with all the women and that he's going to be the great hero because he's boldly doing frontier medicine among all these underachievers. So he's first in his class and all that. And he's going to go among all these schmucks and show them what a real officer's like. But then over time, it turns out that there's more to him than that he does have a chip on his shoulder, that he has some insecurity issues that he takes care of. And actually, he shows a lot of growth over the course of the show. And so he becomes one of the better characters over time, but you have to weigh out the fact that he sucks in the early seasons. But the way he sucks is also entertaining, because not all Starfleet officers need to be good people. Some of them can be dicks. I mean, look at Captain Shaw in the current season of Star Trek Picard. I mean, he's easily the best character, and that guy's a total asshole. He's not a bad guy, he's just an asshole. And Bashir was a little bit like that, except that he didn't know he was being an asshole. He thought that he was being a good guy. I mean, I actually kind of like Bashir because I've met people like him. So in grad school, a lot of the people come from wealthy families. They're kind of entitled, a little out of touch. Doesn't mean they're bad people, but sometimes they can be difficult to get along with. And Bashir reminds me of a lot of them. I mean, if I had to explain to someone who's never been to grad school, what is it like to be around a lot of the people in a PhD program, just look at Bashir season 1 and 2. That's what it's like. So again, not a terrible guy, just someone who has some flaws that can be difficult to deal with. I like his evolution over time, and I like his friendship with O'Brien. I also like that he ultimately accepted that Jadzia chose someone else, and even though I sort of laughed at him not getting with Jadzia, I kind of felt bad for him. I mean, just like a lot of other people, there have been people I pursued that I couldn't land, so I can relate to that all too well, especially people you may have known for a long time. So yeah, I feel like Bashir's relatable, even though he also is aloof and can come off as holier than thou. Um, the genetic enhancement thing, I know a lot of fans hated that part of his story, but I actually think it adds to his character because it shows why he's got this chip on his shoulder and why he's so eager to prove himself, but also to try to pretend that he's just another guy when it's clear that he's not, that he's got this extraordinary academic record. And so anyway, I think Bashir is a good character, and I actually think he, because of his character arc, is an A. Next up, we have Odo, the first changeling that we meet. He is obsessed with law and order. He can be a little bit rigid, even though he is a shapeshifter. So ironically enough, he can be rigid, though. And his moral code is very simplistic. So he's kind of like an Old West sheriff. They even call him the constable at times. His clashes with Quark, especially, and Garrick sometimes are great. He also has a big love interest in Kira. So every time we see her with Bareil and Shakar, you can just see the hurt in Odo. He also really has this complex relationship with the Bajoran scientist who discovered him. So he's constantly searching for an identity, even though he appears like a middle-aged man. He's basically a child. And so once the Dominion is discovered and it turns out that the shapeshifters there are related to him, this creates an interesting dynamic where Odo is the link to, well, the Great Link, which is the sort of center of the Empire. And because he is one of the founding race, this means that this provides some plot shielding, some plot armor for the main crew of DS9, because the Dominion can't just destroy them for the simple reason that they can't destroy one of their gods, because the shapeshifters, the changelings, are considered gods. I love Odo's character, and I think that was one of the great moments in television when he got to be with Kira, at least for a little bit. And yeah, Odo's fantastic. I love Odo. He's an S tier character all day, every day. Now we have the female changeling, and I didn't know this, but apparently the actress who portrays the female changeling used to portray sort of like heartthrob characters back in the 60s. Now, because the changelings have trouble emulating human faces, at least in the DS9 universe, her features are very, very disturbing, and she literally looks like Odo with boobs, so it's really off-putting. But in a way that works, because the female changeling conveys threat and menace while being dressed in a way that's supposed to be, I guess, soothing-ish. So it's kind of like she's such a nefarious character that even in her guise it's supposed to be the most familiar and relaxing, she's still intimidating to the point of being terrifying. And she can't really help it. So the nefarious energy from the female changeling is awesome. And especially once she starts dealing with health issues, you can really hear it in her voice. So the actress does a great job of really conveying the mental and physical state of the changeling. She's also very cunning, but she is ultimately held back because, just like the servants of the Dominion, she will not go after Odo because Odo's one of her own. So she's always trying to win over Odo. She doesn't get quite enough screen time to be S tier, but she's damn close. So I'm going to put her in A tier. She's borderline S tier, though. Another really solid villain. And just a great representation of what the Dominion is about. Because, again, she tries to put a gentle face on it, but the Dominion is so nefarious that there's no doing that. And I think that's perfectly encapsulated by the metaphorical ability of the female changeling to make a face that looks normal or in any way not terrifying. And finally, we have the other Jeffrey Combs character, Weyoun. Jeffrey Combs, by the way, will return in Star Trek Enterprise and play Shran, the Andorian character, which I think is actually his best role. I know Enterprise is not a fan favorite, and it's definitely not as good as DS9 overall, but I think that is Jeffrey Combs' best character, at least. Anyway, Weyoun is also a really good character. So he is part of a species that is specially bred to be kind of the officer class of the Dominion. So they hold overall commands over the Jem'Hadar, and they also handle diplomacy. They have high intelligence, but they also are not very physically intimidating. So they don't really have good fighting skills, and they also have dull senses. So his eyesight is pretty shit. That being said, he also is bred to be completely loyal to the changelings. And the Weyouns are kind of bred in a vat, kind of like in Dune, where you have, what is it, the Bene Tlaxu, who create people in those vats, and they just create clones of the same person over and over. Weyoun has a lot of good scenes because he works closely with Dukat and Damar, and also with the female changeling. And there's also scenes where Weyoun will approach Odo and just be like, you're a god, I love you, you're so amazing. And Odo's like, yeah, fuck off. And then later on, he'll go up to people and be like, Odo, right? He mentioned me? Does he like me? Do I have Odo's approval? I mean, do you think he thinks that I'm a good representation of my people? What do you think Odo thinks about me? Tell him I said hello. Anyway, so it just the way that Weyoun is fascinating, and it tells us a lot about the relationships of the various peoples of the Dominion without really having to spell it out too directly. I will also put Weyoun in the B tier. Again, I don't think he's quite as good as the female changeling, but he has some good moments. So yeah, just kind of like the O'Briens and Ezri, has some good moments, but doesn't quite bring it home. Yeah, Damar, Brunt, yeah, all these are on the same level, I would say. Rom. So anyway, our S tiers again: Sisko, Kira, Wynn, Quark, Worf, Martok, Garrick. I said he's my favorite, then I had trouble remembering his name. Good fucking job. Odo. A tier, we have Joseph Sisko. We have Nog, Grand Nagus Zek, Gowron, Dukat, Jadzia Dax, Eddington, Michael Eddington, Sloane, Bashir, female changeling, B tier, Jake Sisko, Kaiopaka, Rom, Brunt, Damar, Ezri Dax, Miles O'Brien, Keiko O'Brien, and Weyoun. C tier, Morn, Vic Fontaine, Anna Brentane, Zial, and Admiral Ross. William Ross, that is. D tier, Lita, the whatever the fuck his name is, Kira's fuckboy number 1, Kira's fuckboy number 2, so that would be the Vedic Brile and Shakar Eden. And then in E tier, we have Cassidy Yates, the only character who is truly boring and doesn't really add anything to the story. So that's all I have for you. Those are my rankings of the DS9 characters. If you agree, let me know in the comments. If you disagree, also let me know in the comments about why you are incorrect. Anyway, that's it. This has been WTFGAS, and I will see you around when I see ya. Hopefully this will get some momentum flowing so I can do some videos on my main channel, which I have been sadly neglecting due to having way too many fucking students. Anyway, good night everybody, and take care. Have a good week.